All right, guys. Um, this is section 6, and we're going to talk in this section about torture. Torture is a very, very difficult subject. Um, it was hard for me to read about it, to create this presentation. It was hard for me to. It's hard for me to talk about it. I'm sure it'll be hard for you to listen to it. Um, I want you to kind of prepare yourself because there's going to be a lot of disturbing talk, a lot of disturbing images. I've tried to keep it not too overtly graphic, too overtly gory, but when you're talking about torture, you're going to see and hear about a lot of really disturbing things. So if you need to, go take a moment, get a glass of water, have a stuffed animal ready, but we can get through this, okay? The justification for torture, the reason for torture that most people use is that you're inflicting this physical pain on people in order to get information from them. Sometimes that's information about co-conspirators, sometimes it's a confession for crimes they've committed, sometimes it's, lots of different information you can want to get from somebody, but you give them physical pain until they want to give you that information. In reality, the people who study torture, the people who look at its use throughout history and in the current world, they say that's just an excuse. The torture is not, if they get any information out of it, if they get a confession out of it, that's just kind of, bonus. The real intention of torture, the real purpose for torture is to humiliate, to dominate, and to destroy that person as a person. It's to make them not who they are anymore. Okay? There's a great quote from the book by O'Byrne that calls torture silence through violence, right? So if we destroy this person we're torturing, not only are they going to be silent, but we're also going to scare others into being silent, because this person is still technically alive after the torture, usually, but they're not them anymore. We have humiliated and dominated and destroyed their entire sense of self. And that, the experts say, is the real purpose for torture. That's the point of torture. That's the underlying justification underneath what people say they commit torture for. Okay? There's a difference between torture and corporal punishment. Okay? Corporal punishment means you've been convicted of a crime. Hopefully there was a trial, a fair trial, or some kind of hearing or some kind of fair judgment passed, and then the corporal punishment is kind of the sentence. It's usually the amount of pain or painful things is known. They're not trying to even ostensibly elicit a confession or information from the person. They're just being physically hurt as a punishment for some crime or wrongdoing. Okay, this is used in the modern day by legal systems in the Middle East. It's very common. Historically, it's been very common on naval vessels, because in the Navy, if you commit some crime on a ship, they didn't have the space to imprison anybody, nor could they afford to lose a person's labor. So instead of imprisonment, if you committed a crime or a rule violation on a ship, usually, historically, the punishment has been physical pain, corporal punishment. To this day, corporal punishment is used in the United States school system. the public school system in the United States is legally able in many states to use corporal punishment to punish children, students. There's also been a expansion of torture methods to not just include the physical, but also the psychological. Okay, you don't have to physically hurt somebody in order to torture them. You can do it in a lot of psychological ways as well, which we'll talk more about later on in the section. And in the modern day, torture is usually clandestine, i.e. it's not done in full view of the public. It's done in the stereotypical windowless room with concrete walls where nobody can hear the screams. That's because governments and societies and whoever's doing the torture knows that torture is wrong. They accept that torture is wrong. They agree that torture is wrong, but they're doing it anyway because they believe that they're justified in committing these crimes. So, little history of torture. In the ancient Greek city of Athens, it was believed that any testimony that a slave might give had to be testimony taken under torture. They thought that if a slave gave testimony without torture, it was non-believable. So if a slave wanted to provide testimony in any kind of hearing or case or whatever, it had to be done via torture. In Rome, they said not only are we allowed to torture slaves, we're allowed to torture citizens too. So it was a very big thing in the Roman Empire, right? Torture was a fairly common thing. The Catholic Church, because of kind of the history of the Catholic Church, because early Christians in the Roman Empire were tortured a lot, the Catholic Church for a long time banned torture of all kinds. No more torture. We were the victims of torture way too often. We're not accepting it. But then in the 13th century, they brought it back. They said, okay, we can torture for the Inquisition. Right, that was a multi-century long thing where they were trying to find heretics and blasphemers within the church and doing this Inquisition, this giant investigation into who's just pretending and who's really Catholic and all these things. But the other thing that the Roman Empire's embrace of torture did was kind of change how the legal systems of Europe evolved. Okay, so for the continent of Europe, for the vast majority of the European countries, their legal systems after the collapse of the Roman Empire were still based on this Roman system, right? So even to this day, we call the French system and German systems and Italian systems, all those are still based on Roman law. Whereas in England, in the UK, Ireland, that area, those islands off the coast, their judicial system evolved based on what's called common law, which is very different from the Roman law in many ways, including torture. So the Roman law countries, continental Europe, continued to use torture as a fairly common thing, whereas in England it was much less common because of the fact that their legal system was based on common law and not Roman law. And then, of course, the kind of former English colony countries in the modern day, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, our legal systems are all based on the common law of England, not the Roman law of continental Europe. In the 20th century, torture kind of reached new levels. It got increasingly disturbing, increasingly common, increasingly justified. Um, some of the more famous examples are the fascist countries of the first half of the 20th century, right? It started in Italy, then Spain and Germany, all fascist dictatorships, and they use torture very commonly. Um, Germany is very famous for having, their concentration camps and Jewish people and homosexuals, Romani, all these different groups were tortured. Um, and most of the time, they didn't even bother trying to get information or confessions. It was just torture for the sake of torture. The Japanese, not actually listed there, but also really, the Japanese culture of the time was so focused on honor and the Japanese as this kind of perfect society, and they were the only ones with true honor. So when American soldiers would surrender to the Japanese would see that as a dishonorable act. How could you surrender? That's totally dishonorable. Thus, you don't even deserve basic human rights because you're dishonorable. So we're going to kill you, we're going to torture you, we're going to starve you, do all these really, really horrible things. Luckily, the leaders of most of those countries, Japan, Germany, etc., the people who maintained and profited from those torture systems faced trial after the war. If they didn't die during the war, they faced trial after the war, and most of them were either imprisoned or executed for these crimes against humanity that they committed against their own people or people in occupied countries. But yeah, what the Germans, the Japanese, and all the Axis powers did as far as torture and abuse goes is really maybe one of the pinnacles of evil in human history. In very similar ways, and just as, or almost as bad, or just as bad as those systems, but getting far less attention from media and historians and all that stuff, are the post-colonial dictatorships, right? So, throughout, kind of everywhere from the end of the 15th century to the mid-20th century, so much of the world was colonized by Western Europe, right? The entire Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, basically all of Africa, a lot of Asia. It was colonized and controlled in really horrible ways by these colonial powers. And the native groups were treated horribly. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the genocide chapter. But these colonial governments, kind of their final act of evil was to either purposefully set up or turn a blind eye to the dictatorships that arose in the 20th century when they finally left being colonized countries in many of these cases, but especially in Central and South America and Africa. Okay, as the colonial powers left, they either purposefully propped up or turned a blind eye to these dictators arising in their place that did really, really, really horrible things. We talked a little bit about the disappearances in the last section, but there's also, looking at some of the things that were done in Africa by post-colonial dictatorships is really, really, truly horrible and scary. The tortures, the abuses, people starving, people being it's a really, yeah, I'm going to stop there. Theoretically, torture is outlawed in the Geneva Conventions, both for military personnel and civilians. Okay, again, the Geneva Conventions evolved over basically 100 years, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. And one of the things that was put in was an outright ban on any torture or cruel punishment of military personnel or civilians. So any country that has signed the Geneva Conventions is legally barred from torturing people by international law and treaty. But that doesn't stop people. In Israel, they have had legal rulings where their version of the Supreme Court has come and said, look, in this case, we're going to allow torture for this terrorist suspect. Again, the overt justification is so we can get information about the other terrorists, when in reality that probably wasn't the actual reason. That was just the excuse they used. They just wanted to scare the terrorists and make them afraid to commit these terrorist acts against their country. In the UK, a lot of how the British treated the Irish, what they referred to as terrorists, has been ruled to be torture. It's been found to be torturous, cruel, and inhuman punishment. France was actually, there were 5 police officers that were convicted in that European court, which we talked about, I think, back in section 3? We talked about the European Court of Human Rights. There were 5 police officers from France that were convicted in that court for committing torture on a person. And in the United States, Amnesty International has actually written reports talking about how many aspects of the United States prison system amount to torture, amount to cruel and inhuman punishment of the prisoners we hold here in the United States. A lot of that, although by no means all, a lot of that centers around our use of solitary confinement, which is very akin to torture, cruel and unusual punishment. Because remember, it doesn't have to be physical, although I would argue that enforced idleness is physical. But it doesn't have to be physical. It can be, there's psychological torture as well, which we will talk about in the next subsection. So I'll see you then.